Hello and welcome to our latest blog post here on BetaBrains. I am Mihai Nakshu and I'm the Business Development Manager here at Beta. I am pleased you've come back to read or listen to our latest blog post. Thank you. As I've said in previous blog posts, there has been quite a lot of discussion about data vault in public spaces such as LinkedIn. As a result, we decided to do a series of blog posts about data vault and putting it into perspective when considered among the other ways of building data warehouses. My comments are all things that are well known in the data warehousing area. There is nothing controversial about what I'm saying. So, let's go. Firstly, I wanted to touch on the positioning of Data Vault and Dan Lindstedt in the data warehousing area. As Ken Graziano mentioned in public to us, Dan did not go public about Data Vault until around 2001. Those of us who were in the data warehousing business in the 90s, like Peter, knew of Dan's and his idea. Peter personally knew about the forerunner of Data Vault around 1996 or 1997, something like that. Peter was involved with the Australian reseller of Bill Enman's software from 1996 onwards. Somewhere along the line, Peter heard about Dan and what he was doing. A number of people he knew told him about Dan's ideas. Many people who knew about Dan linked it to whether it made sense implementing Dan's ideas using Bill's Prism ETL software and later DataStage. Obviously, Ardent, who were also aware of Dan since they bought Prism Solutions. Most people, including Peter, decided to stick with Bill's proposed time variance plus stability analysis modeling techniques. There were many reasons for this. One of the main reasons was that it was hard enough to sell data warehouses already. They did not need to introduce a more esoteric and abstract modeling technique to make their sales process even harder. Even today, you see people complain about how hard it is to persuade customers to use Data Vault. Well, imagine what it would have been like in the late 90s. People were still having to explain the use of dimensional models in each sale in the late 90s. To try and sell Data Vault would have killed the sale in most cases because IBM and Teradata were selling third normal form data warehouses. It was hard enough to sell an archive layer that was designed to Bill's proposed TV plus SA technique against IBM and Teradata. They did not need to introduce something that was unheard of and esoteric at the time. So, I want to dispel the idea in public that those of her who were the leaders in data warehousing in the late 90s did not know who Dan was or did not know who Data Vault was. People like Peter knew who Dan was. People like Peter knew what Data Vault was. It was not a sellable idea in the marketplace at that point in time because the people they had to beat were IBM, Oracle, and Teradata. IBM was not hard to beat in Australia, but they were hard to beat in other places. It's that simple. Next, I want to talk about those who were the top 5 men who have influenced our industry segment the most, balanced with who was the best in the business, even if their industry influence was not as great. This is kind of a stroll down memory lane for the old guys, and it will be a history lesson for you younger guys. Of course, these are Peter's opinions since I am new to the space. Number 1. Bill Enman. I think it goes without saying that Bill is the most influential figure in the data warehousing area. Bill came up with the idea of archiving data when most of us were struggling to simply record the data that was being generated via applications. You have to remember how expensive disk and processing was for mainframe computers at the time. When put that into context, you realize what a breakthrough idea it was to archive that operational data. It was such a radical idea that for many years people rejected the idea out of hand. I would like to mention that Bill invented a new idea. He did not take an existing idea and improve it as Ralph did. It is 1,000 times harder to invent a new idea that has never existed before than to take an already existing idea and improve it. At least 1,000 times harder. So, Bill has to go at the top of the list for inventing the idea of data warehousing in the first place. Number 2. Ralph Kimball. Ralph is a personal friend of Peter's and he has the greatest respect for Ralph. That said, Ralph was an engineer, and what engineers do is take existing ideas and make them better. That is the specialty of an engineer. The first commercial multidimensional database was released by RRI Software sometimes in the 70s. They sold the Nielsen data using their software. People in the marketing departments of massing retailers and CPG companies were using their software to improve their return on marketing dollar investment. Ralph moved from Xerox PARC to Metaphor Computer System along with David Little and Don Mazario and Charles Irby. You can read about Metaphor Computer Systems on the bottom on the webpage. So, Rolf was far from on his own in getting started at Metaphor. David Little and Charles Irby are very well known for their work at Xerox PARC. Metaphor took aim at IRI and wanted to eat their lunch. One of the questions was, what sort of database should we use? Rolf and others proposed that they should develop their own relational database. This was based on the idea that relational databases will scale better over time than multidimensional databases. The star schema was simply the relational implementation of multidimensional models that were already in use and made popular by IRI. Sure, it was a big step up forward from a multidimensional database, but it was not the invention of something new. The metaphor item that was a new invention was the idea of capsule. Rolf left Metaphor after IBM became involved, and he went on to create a company called Red Brick, which was a dimensional model-based database company. The Metaphor experience created a whole series of people who went on to make their mark on the data warehousing industry. Number 3. Sean Kelly. Sean Kelly is arguably the number 3 person who influenced the data warehousing industry. He was younger and he came after Bill Inman and Ralph Kimball. He wrote a series of books and created the Data Warehouse Network. He pioneered the idea of vertical package solutions. He was able to sell and implement these models to very large companies very successfully. In the end, the Data Warehouse Network and vertical package solutions were sold to Sybase for an undisclosed amount. Sean Kelly then went on to be VP of Business Intelligence for Sybase EMEA, and his main area of focus was improving the profitability of the companies that bought the data models. Those people like Peter work with Sean, know the caliber of the man. So Peter's personal opinion is that Sean Kelly sits at number 3. Number 4. John Doe number 1. He does not wish to be made a public figure, so I won't mention his name. This is the man that many call the world's greatest data modeler. He was the man who actually invented the vertical package solutions while working on projects won by Sean Kelly as part of the Data Warehouse Network. He came up with the design techniques that are embedded into the Sybase Industry Warehouse Studio models without the benefit of Ralph Kimball's book being available. He was the man who figured out how to archive data into a dimensional model. This was called the entity profile in the Sybase Industry Warehouse Studio data models, and everyone who saw the IWS models back in those days realized that they had seen the future of how data warehouse models will be developed, especially for large business-to-consumer companies that have high transaction volumes. That the models he invented were commonly sold for $150,000 tells you how advanced those models were. This is because it is very hard to sell data models to IT shops because the people in IT shop generally believe they can do a much better job. Some of those people who were trained on the IWS models went on to develop similar data warehouses after Sybase was purchased by SAP in 2006. For inventing all the modeling techniques needed to build large complex dimensional models that allow archiving of data, he makes our list as number 4. Number 5. John Doe number 2. Again, this man does not wish to be made a public figure. He is well known among those of you who have been around for a long time. In the 80s, he joined Metaphor as a database modeler. He rose up the ranks in Metaphor, and when Ralph Kimball left in 1989, he took over the role of number 1 data modeler for Metaphor. So he was trained directly by Ralph and took over Ralph Kimball's job when Ralph moved on. He led the Metaphor data modeling team from 1989 to 1994. When IBM retrenched all the consultants from Metaphor in 1994, he moved to Price Waterhouse, where he took over the leadership of the development of Price Waterhouse data warehousing practice. By 1999, Price Waterhouse has merged with Coopers and Librand to become Price Waterhouse Coopers. It was by far the largest data warehouse and business intelligence consulting firm in the world, with more than 1,500 people in the data warehousing practice area. It was later part of PwC business that was sold back to IBM for $3.5 billion in 2002. Presumably, a nice portion of the sale price made it into the pocket of this man who was made redundant by IBM just 8 years earlier. So, this man, as much as any, was instrumental in creating the largest and most successful data warehousing consulting practice in the world. He, quite literally, wrote the PricewaterhouseCoopers data warehousing methodology. In 1996, PricewaterhouseCoopers, by the way of John Doe 2, adopted the idea of combining Bill's archival models with Rolf's dimensional models to create a comprehensive and expensive end-to-end data warehousing design solution. PricewaterhouseCoopers remained unchallenged as the leading data warehousing consultancy from 1997 through the sale of this area of the business to IBM in 2002. For my money, those are the top 5 most influential people in the data warehousing area. I can tell you that Peter is very proud to say that they're all his personal friends. Each of them has made a great contribution to his skill over the years. Each of them has put money in Peter's pocket from the lessons they were willing to teach him. We have brought all of that knowledge into beta. Next, one could argue that Michael Saylor should be on the list. However, I am not putting him on the list because MicroStrategy is more of a software company than a data warehousing company. Also, the ideas of data models and the aggregate navigation built into MicroStrategy came from Metaphor people in the first place. Those are our proposed top 5 most influential people in the data warehousing area of our market. What do you think of this list? Do you agree or do you disagree? Please feel free to put your comments in the comment section below. The point of listing them is that Dan Lindstedt and DataVault are not on this list. It will be the topic of some debate as to whether Dan belongs in the group of 6 to 10. As I mentioned, Ken Graziano notes that Dan did not go public with DataVault until around 2001. There were a vast number of data warehouses built in the 90s. All the issues of building data warehouses were resolved by the 5 men I have named plus the men who worked with them on their projects. One of those men no longer wishes to be a public figure. He has recently taken down his websites and made it clear he is no longer a public figure. So we call him John Doe 3. John Doe 3 is also a personal friend of ours here at Beta. However, in 2011 he was one of the very early victims of cancel culture. John Doe 3 worked for IBM Australia in their International Software Development Laboratory in Australia in the 80s. He worked in the area of billing and pricing systems for IBM products. As such, he was very well trained in how to develop systems that were balanced to the cent. Systems that had very high levels of security and auditability associated with them. IBM had an internal software development standard called Application System Controls and Auditability. This standard was intended to reduce the possibility of fraud inside IBM. There were many well-known cases of fraud inside IBM because of the vast sums of money that were changing hands. Those who wanted to commit fraud could do it most easily with least risk being caught through the new computer system that was being deployed. Fraud prevention in computer system was in its infancy in the 80s. So when this man came into the data warehousing area, he brought with him all the IBM ideas on how to implement controls and auditability into data warehouses and ETL systems that populated them. He also brought the idea that using the data warehouse for fraud detection was a very good use of this sort of archival technology. Indeed, the richest man in Australia in the 90s, Kerry Packer, bought many copies of John Doe 3's ETL software and had data warehouses built for the specific reason of detecting and preventing fraud. His son, James Packer, and business partner Lachlan Murdoch had just lost $700 million because of claimed fraud with the company they founded called OneTel. John Doe 3 helped Kerry Packer turn one of his companies around in 2000. In the data warehouse project, he had implemented fraud prevention and detection. Having been told of this, Kerry Packer instructed all his remaining companies to implement something similar to help prevent any further future fraud. John Doe 3 sold a number of copies of his ETL software to these companies. I wanted to make the point that by the year 2000, all such issues as security, auditability, fraud prevention, fraud detection, and rapid generation of ETL systems were all truly well and resolved. The question of how to archive data in a dimensional model was also solved. However, because Sybase IWS models were being sold for $150,000 per copy, the technique of archiving data inside the dimensional model remained a closely guarded secret. This was similar to how Metaphor had guarded the secrets of building dimensional models until IBM retrenched them all in 1994. Next, by 2000, people were also building lots of operational data stores. Some people were accidentally building operational data stores in the mid-90s, but they didn't have a name for them. These were subject-oriented and integrated databases we were implementing for call centers. Call centers have become a big thing by the mid-90s, and they needed a database to access. It looked sort of like a data warehouse, only it ran transactions from the call center. Bill Inman finally gave this phenomenon a name, which was the operational data store. So, by 2000, people were building operational data stores using third normal form. People were building archival data stores using Bill's time variance plus stability analysis models. And people were building dimensional models on top because that's what was best for the business users of data warehouses. By the year 2000, the matter was settled. Dimensional models had won the day, and dimensional models would be the standard for the presentation of data to business users who queried the data directly. The three different modeling forms meant that the development of these very different models was very expensive. PricewaterhouseCoopers was loving all of this because they could justify the expense. A lot of those 1,500 consultants at PricewaterhouseCoopers were working on building these three different model types. It was well understood that there was a very high level of overlap in the data held in these models. Consider that in high volume transaction consumer businesses, the transactions form the vast bulk of the data. This data existed in three different model types in three different places. It was obvious to everyone that if some way could be found to use dimensional modeling in the archive layer and the operational data store, then the cost of deployment would dramatically decrease. One more point before we go on. The man listed as John Doe number 2 actually went to Australia at the invitation of the man listed as John Doe number 3 in 1994. This was to work for an IBM Australia customer who had Metaphor installed. The work was to design the prototype of the next generation dimensional data model for the IBM customer. While there, John Doe number 2 trained John Doe number 3 on the basics of dimensional models and the ETL development for dimensional models. John Doe number 3 was then left to figure the rest out for himself. As a result of this working together, John Does 2 and 3 worked together for years and years to figure out if there was some way to archive data into dimensional models. They never found one. It was not until John Doe number 3 joined Sean Kelly's team at Sybase in 2001 and that the class taught John Doe number 1 that he discovered that this problem had been trying to solve for over 5 years had indeed been resolved by John Doe number 1. Indeed, it had been solved about 5 years prior. John Doe number 3 told me that John Doe number 1 explained the quote entity profile end quote table in class. He immediately understood he had been presented with the solution he had been looking for about 5 years. On seeing the solution, John Doe 3 discussed the feature that it was revealed that yes, indeed, the Sybase IWS model could be used to implement operational data stores and archival layers of data warehouses. By doing so, the overall cost of implementing an operational data stores, an archival layer, and dimensional layers would be reduced by at least 50% when using Sybase IWS models. Further, the cost of maintenance and the cost of running these sorts of processing would also be greatly reduced. It was explained in class that this ability was one of the main drivers of sales to large companies, especially telcos. John Doe number 3, being a salesman, realized that he was going to make a great deal of money selling and then implementing these Sybase IWS models. He went on to do so. Indeed, he later worked very closely with Sean Kelly at Sean Kelly and Associates when the next generation of data models was developed starting 2006. So I have added the above section to make this point. That point being, by the time Dan came out to the public with the ideas of Data Vault, 2 of the top 5 people in our business had already come up with how to build an operational data store, archive layers, and dimensional models, all with one modeling technique. When John Doe 3 joined the Sybase team, he brought with him all the IBM standards and experience on how to implement security, auditability, and fraud detection into the IWS models. John Doe 3 later updated the ETL software he wrote in COBOL in the 90s to C++ for the zeros. He adapted his ETL software to support the Sybase IWS models to make implementing them even faster and cheaper. So, by 2003, Sybase had by some margin the best data modeling offering in the marketplace. They were selling them like hotcakes. They were selling them to very large companies like telcos. In fact, because Sean Kelly had gotten his start at the Irish Telecoms company, telecoms was the #1 segment for Sybase IWS models. There were those who say online such nonsense as Data Vault is the best way to implement a data warehouse with security, controls, and auditability. This is nonsense. My question back would be as follows. What do you think the rest of the people were doing in the 90s and early 2000s? Implementing data warehouses without security, controls, and auditability? The track record of the Sybase IWS models speaks for themselves. Their track record also speaks for Sean Kelly and John Doe #1. These models were very successful. This was despite the fact that IT people mostly refuse to buy models because they think they can develop better models themselves. The whole idea of Data Vault being so popular in IT circles, while there are no industry standard Data Vault model offerings, makes the point that it is the IT people who are excited about Data Vault, and not the business people. Next, after Sybase was purchased by SAP in 2006, Sean Kelly and Associates embarked on developing Vertical Package Solutions 2.0. They focused on telco models and sold 2 such models to telcos in the UK on Netezza. Having proven the 2.0 models worked on Netezza and having gained 2 great reference accounts for the next generation models, they partnered closely with Netezza. In partnership with Netezza, Sean Kelly was talking with all the major telcos in Europe about the next generation of telco models. This new generation of models would deliver greatly increased functionality at the cost unchallenged by IBM, Teradata, and Oracle. Unfortunately for Sean Kelly and Associates, IBM bought Netezza in 2010. Not long after this, Sean Kelly became ill and he passed away in 2012. John Doe #3 had been cancelled in 2011, so these 2.0 models were no longer being purchased by companies, even though they would have benefited from them. Next, I recently found out that the all IWS models were slightly updated by SAP and made public around 2014. They were still public around 2018. However, the links on the public post in 2018 are now dead. I can't find anyone at SAP who has any comment on these old models. Even so, the next generation of models that were developed by Sean Kelly and Associates contain many features which are a vast improvement on the Sybase IWS models. Not the least of which is that they are maintained in spreadsheets and not a data modeling tool. So, even though there is a lot of enthusiasm and excitement for Data Vault amongst IT people, those who are so enthusiastic and so excited might just wonder what it was for the rest of the industry has been doing all this time if they have not been doing Data Vault. They might wonder how some people have been able to consistently deliver very large projects for very large companies at such low prices and to give their customers such great return on investment, all without a Data Vault in sight. Our view is that Data Vault has its place in the world, and we will publish another blog post about that later. Our view is that dimensional models will continue to dominate the data warehousing area of large business-to-consumer companies that have very high transaction volumes like telcos, retailers, and banks. In these areas, we will continue to see IBM and Teradata offer third normal form archives plus dimensional models on top of these archives. This modeling form has its benefits and its issues that we all fully understand. Beta will continue to rely on the design points laid down by the world's best data modeler in the 90s. If we see a better idea, we will integrate it in what we're doing. But this is a very big but. We only have seen one very small design improvement in 25 years. That was the design improvement of putting an integer key in front of the entity profile in 2002. We haven't seen any new design technique improvement in these models since then. We haven't seen any dimensional model design technique improvement suggested by anyone else in that time either. So, we think we are on pretty solid ground. In summary, there is a great deal of enthusiasm and excitement in the IT community about Data Vault today. It is our opinion that it is somewhat misplaced given that in the high volume business to consumer segment, dimensional models will remain dominant for the foreseeable future. Further, and we will cover this in another blog post, the future of data warehousing does not include IT people developing data warehousing data models for their own companies. That will end. You will not have data warehouse data modelers working inside companies building their data warehouse in the future any more than you will have IT people building ERPs for their companies today. The days of IT people developing data warehouses and BI solutions, especially the data model portion internally for the companies, are numbered. In the future, data warehouse data models and end-to-end solutions will be developed and implemented by companies like Beta. That is our prediction. We are putting our money where our mouth is. We will see if we are right in about 5 years' time. In finishing, thank you very much for your time and attention. We really appreciate you dropping by to read or listen to our blogs. Have a great day.